The tent breathed like a living thing. Canvas shuddered with each distant concussion, lanterns swayed on their hooks, and maps pinned to plywood walls quivered as if they could feel the pressure wave rolling in from the hills. A low rumble lived in the floorboards, a constant, teeth-buzzing vibration from artillery landing somewhere out there, far enough to be routine, close enough to make the coffee ripple in tin mugs. Inside the forward command tent, the light was a tired yellow glow. Screens washed faces in cold blue, casting the staff in moving shadows as cursors danced over digital maps. Voices overlapped in a low, focused murmur, grid coordinates, logistics updates, fragmentary reports from patrols pushing into the ridgeline. On the central table, a topographical map of the basin sprawled beneath clear plastic, grease pencil marks cutting across the terrain like scars. The tent sat in the center of that map, a small rectangle in a shallow bowl of earth, ringed by tan blocks marking HESCO barriers and vehicle positions. Beyond them, a jagged half-moon of elevation rose to the north and east, the ridgeline, looming like teeth. Artillery still probing to the north, one staff captain said, tapping at a blinking icon. Impact trend is drifting away from us. A signal tech, headset crooked around his neck, flicked through tabs as if he could will the interference out of the spectrum. Net still clean, he called out. Couple pops of static on the outer bands, but within tolerance. At the head of the table stood the general. 2 stars on his chest, crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the weight of the basin's calm sitting on his shoulders. He listened more than he spoke, one hand resting on the edge of the map, fingertips pressed over the thin rectangle drawn where the command tent itself now stood. "Who's got eyes on the ridge?" he asked, not looking up. "Tower 2, sir," replied an operations major. "And the sniper team when they're back from the recon run. Right now it's just the tower." The general grunted, eyes still on the contours. "Fine, as long as someone's watching." He never got to finish the thought. The first incoming round didn't scream in. It arrived like a hammer. A white flash punched through the far wall of the tent, instantly followed by a blast that snuffed the lanterns and slammed air out of lungs. The central table jumped, maps and coffee and pens flying. The world went white-brown, dust, shredded canvas, the taste of earth filling mouths. The general's knee buckled. Something slammed into his shoulder, whether it was a body, a folding chair, or the invisible fist of the blast, he couldn't tell. He hit the floor hard, ears ringing so violently that for a heartbeat he thought the world had gone truly silent. Then the sound came back all at once. Sirens wailed. Someone screamed. Radios, still working for the moment, exploded with voices shouting over each other. "Impact! Impact! North side, near the motor pool. I've got casualties in." "Confirm. That was danger close. That was..." Dust poured from the ceiling, drifting in thick curtains. A support pole creaked. One of the big plasma screens flickered, went black, then snapped back to life, showing nothing but a frozen map and a spinning icon. "Get him back!" a voice yelled. Hands grabbed at the general's vest, dragging him across scattered binders and broken plastic. A steel folding table went over with a clatter and was hauled in front of him, suddenly repurposed from workspace to ballistic shield. Staff officers scrambled for cover wherever they could find it, behind overturned chairs, under the lip of the stage where briefings were given hours earlier. "Where did that land?" the general rasped, coughing dust. "Talk to me." "Just outside the north corner, sir," gasped the ops major, one hand pressed to a small cut on his forehead, the other gripping a handheld radio. That wasn't random. As if to answer him, another round landed, this one closer. The floor lurched, lanterns swinging wildly before one finally tore loose and crashed to the ground, glass shattering. The concussion punched through the tent, flattening papers against the far wall. A staff officer staggered, then crumpled with a sharp cry, clutching his leg. "Corpsman!" someone shouted. The radios were still talking over each other, call signs overlapping until the air was a wall of indecipherable noise. The signal tech hunched over his console, jabbing at switches. "Net control, 3-6, say again." "You're unreadable, break." Static roared back at him. More voices tried to cut through it, but everything sounded distant, smeared like a conversation underwater. Call signs blurred into white noise. The tech spun a dial, watching the bars on his spectrum analyzer spike and dance. "Sir," he shouted toward the general. "Something's wrong with the net. I'm losing." His words died as all the radios screamed, and then abruptly went dead. No hiss, no chatter, no background hum, just nothing. In the sudden radio silence, the tent felt more fragile, as though all that unseen connectivity had been holding it together. "The brigade net just went dark," the signal tech yelled, voice high with disbelief. "It's not us, it's everything." Outside, another impact slammed into the base perimeter. The tent wall bowed inward, the canvas groaning as shock waves rolled past. Through a tear in the fabric, the general caught a glimpse of the world beyond their dim glow. The basin spread out around them in shades of gray, dust and smoke hanging low, dimming the last light of day. Vehicles crouched behind barriers, silhouettes broken up by hastily tied camouflage nets. The ground sloped up on all sides to the jagged ridge, already darker than the sky above it. And along that ridge, in the gathering dusk, muzzle flashes began to strobe. They were too many, too regular. A curtain of fire tracing the lip of the high ground. "Mortars!" someone shouted outside. "Incoming, incoming!" A string of impacts marched across the base, one after another, walking in from the outer wire. The pattern wasn't random. Anyone who'd ever been under accurate fire could feel the intention in it. The shells chased each other in tight intervals, each landing a little closer to the center of the bowl, where the command tent sat like a target. A blast punched into the far side of the tent compound. A staff officer, halfway through a sprint to the entrance flap, flew sideways and slid motionless, his headset skittering away across the plywood floor. The general's stomach dropped with a grim, cold realization. "They're bracketing us," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They're not walking fire across the whole base. They're correcting onto this tent." He forced himself upright, bracing a hand on the makeshift steel shield. Dust streaked his face, but his eyes were sharp, snapping to the ops major. "Where's my sniper team?" His voice cut through the chaos, command tone honed over decades. "I want glass on that ridge now." The major flinched. "Sir, they're still out with the recon element on the far side. ETA, unknown. We don't have a shooter on site." The answer seemed impossible. For a heartbeat, the general could only stare. "No glass on the ridge," he repeated, incredulous. "Not even a spotter with a long gun." "Negative, sir. Towers only. Rules of engagement keep the heavy weapons locked down without confirmation, and we—" He didn't get a finish. Tracers from a heavy machine gun lanced down from the high ground, bright green lines stitching across the basin. The heavy's deep, rhythmic thump rolled over them, a mechanical heartbeat of destruction. The rounds chewed into the open ground between barriers. A squad that had been trying to move toward the northern sector dove for what little cover they could find, one soldier spinning and dropping as a round smashed into his plate carrier with enough force to slam him flat. Armored vehicles that might have offered protection idled uselessly, their engines coughing smoke from peppered radiators and shrapnel-punctured hoods. One turret tried to traverse. A glancing hit sparked against the ring, and the gun slumped, jammed off target. The base was pinned. Anyone who moved in the open paid for it immediately. Inside the tent, the staff's frantic energy had given way to a strained, brittle sort of focus. They were trained for this in theory. Battle drills, contingency plans, laminated cards. But theory didn't usually involve the unit's nerve center being singled out like prey in a bowl. The general swept the room, mind racing through options that all seemed to slam into the same brick wall. No comms, no precise overwatch, no way to coordinate anything beyond shouting distance. "We need that gun on the ridge found and killed," he snapped. "I don't care if it's a designated sniper, a tower guard, or a cook with a scoped rifle. Give me someone who can reach out and touch them." At the edge of the chaos, outside the tent's main entrance, another scene was unfolding unnoticed. Between two stacked supply containers, in a sliver of shadow that the flares and impacts hadn't yet claimed. A single figure knelt. She was still, almost eerily calm compared to the panicked motion around her. Her hands moved with economical precision, thumbs flipping metal latches, lifting the lid on a battered hard case. Inside lay the M24, its matte barrel disassembled alongside the stock, foam cut around each component like a puzzle. She lifted the receiver free, checked the chamber with a quick glance, then began to put the rifle together. The bolt slid home with a reassuring metallic click. She worked at once, feeling the motion, confirming its smoothness. Around her, soldiers rushed past without really seeing her. A medic dragging a casualty by the straps of his vest, a runner clutching a notepad as if it were a lifeline, a squad leader shouting for his team to stay in cover until the heavy gun paused. She rose, swinging a bandolier of ammunition over her shoulder in one practiced motion, slinging the rifle so the weight settled against her spine. For a moment she stood there, invisible in plain sight, part of the backdrop of organized chaos. Then she stepped out into the ruined sunlight. The air beyond the container row was a haze of dust and smoke, tinged orange by the dying day. Tracers carved bright scars through it, each line a reminder of the high ground they did not control. Incoming fire still rocked the base, though the pattern was tightening, the impacts converging toward the command node like a fist closing. Troops sprinted from cover to cover, low and fast. Others hugged earth, waiting for a lull. Shouts bounced off the barriers in fragments. "Stay down. They're on the ridge. I can't raise anyone. The net is." She moved against that tide, not hurrying but not slow, either. Purpose controlled her stride. Ducking instinctively when a shell burst close enough to shower her with dirt, she cut across the open space and climbed onto a low stack of sandbags at the edge of the command compound. Heads turned for a second at the sight of her silhouette against the light. Slender, unarmored compared to the bulkier infantry around her, the rifle long and unmistakable in her hands. Then the next blast hit, and everyone ducked again, attention dragged away by survival. Inside the tent, the general caught motion through the torn canvas flap. He saw a figure step onto the sandbag wall, shoulder the M24, and lie prone along the crest like a shadow with a barrel. The sight yanked something raw from his throat. "Who gave her that rifle?" he bellowed, fury and disbelief blending into the shout. "Get her down from there before she gets herself killed." No one answered. Most of the staff hadn't seen her. Those who were too busy trying not to die. Outside, she settled behind the rifle as if she'd been born to it. Her elbows dug into the sandbags. The butt of the rifle nested into the pocket of her shoulder. She tucked her cheek against the stock, eyes lining up with the scope. Her breathing slowed, the rise and fall of her back smoothing out. The battlefield noise roared around her. Sirens, shouting, distant artillery, the staccato rattle of rifles, the heavier thump of the machine gun. But inside the little circle of glass, another world blinked into being. It was narrower, simpler, controlled. The reticle slid across the ridgeline, over burning scrub and jagged rock, over the flicker of muzzle flashes and dug-in positions. She adjusted elevation almost without thinking, fingers spinning the turret with tiny, precise movements. Inside the tent, the general was still halfway to ordering someone outside to drag her in when he realized none of his words were reaching her. The radios were dead, the base net strangled by invisible fingers. All he had was his voice, and the flapping canvas swallowed that easily. He watched helplessly as she inched the rifle, micrometer by micrometer, finding something on the ridge he couldn't see from where he sat. Out through the scope, beyond the obvious flicker of rifles and the strobing heavy gun, something else lurked. A shape that didn't quite match rock. A shadow that moved in a way terrain didn't. Her finger came to rest on the trigger. She took in a breath. Let half of it go. The reticle steadied. For a heartbeat, the sound dropped out. The sirens, the shouts, the distant booms, all of it faded into a low, muted throb, like the ocean heard through a thick wall. There was only the feel of the stock against her cheek, the slight tremor in her own pulse, the crosshairs resting on a target none of the others had spotted yet. As she began to press the trigger, a voice, our narrator, slipped in over the hush, promising to explain how any of this could have happened. How a quiet intelligence officer ended up with a rifle that was never meant to be hers. The rifle's bolt slid forward with a clean, mechanical sound as she chambered that first round. And with that metallic click still echoing, time snapped backward. The scene fractured into light and dust, freezing on the tightening crosshairs before dissolving into the softer, washed-out colors of that same basin. Hours earlier, when everything was calm and no one thought the map on the table was already set up to kill them. Morning in the basin felt almost peaceful. Dust hung in the air like a veil, catching the first rays of sun in a golden haze that made the forward base look almost picturesque from a distance, if you ignored the concertina wire and the armored vehicles lining the inner roads. The ridgeline crouched on the horizon, its jagged teeth softened by the early light. Watchtowers punctured the skyline at intervals, little metal silhouettes with dangling antennas. The command tent, its canvas still intact and unscarred, rose in the center of the bowl, surrounded by offices made of Konex containers and prefabricated huts. Inside the wire, life followed the rhythm of any deployed morning. Generators muttered, mess hall line snaked around a corner, and somewhere a radio played a song just quiet enough not to attract unwanted attention. The narrator's voice eased back and over these scenes, measured and steady. Before the first round fell, the voice said, before the net went dead and the ridge lit up, the basin was just another on a larger map. A forward command node, one of many, tasked with watching over something more valuable than itself. Cut to a shot of the plateau beyond the ridge, sun flaring off a cluster of satellite dishes and antenna masts like a small forest of metal. Cables ran from them into hardened shelters half buried in the earth. That uplink, the voice continued, pushed encrypted traffic back to higher headquarters. Operations orders, intelligence summaries, names, patterns, all the invisible threads that keep a war from falling apart. It was the brainstem behind everything moving in this sector. In this tent, the camera drifted back down to the command node, was the place that kept that brainstem alive. Inside, the light was softer, the sirens non-existent. PowerPoint slides glowed on a battered projector screen. The same map from the cold open lay across the table, but the grease pencil marks were fewer, neat, and color-coded. At the far end of the table, behind a laptop whose fan whined faintly in the quiet, sat Captain Mara Hart. She wore a faded soft shell over her uniform, sleeves pushed up, a mug of coffee going lukewarm beside the keyboard. Her hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. A headset rested around her neck and used at the moment. On her screen, 3 windows competed for space. Live drone video of a dry riverbed, a catalog of intercepted enemy radio snippets scrubbed of identifying frequencies, and an old terrain model of the basin from 6 months earlier. She clicked between them with a patience that came from long hours of doing exactly this. The drone feed showed nothing but rock, scrub, and the occasional go path. The intercepted chatter was mostly routine, complaints about food, cryptic references to small arms deliveries, bits of bravado. The terrain model, though, held her attention. She leaned closer, comparing it to a newer satellite image pinned beside her laptop, printed in grainy grayscale. In the older image, a cluster of rock gullies near the ridgeline showed faint white streaks, paths worn by shepherds and their flocks. A small square structure sat near them, its shadow indicating rough height. In the newer image, those tracks were gone. The shack was gone too. The ground looked too clean, as if someone had carefully swept their presence out of the picture. A chair scraped beside her. A logistics officer dropped into it, rubbing his eyes. "You ever get tired of staring at the same rocks?" he muttered, half joking, half genuinely exhausted. "Feels like this basin is all I see, even when I close my eyes." Mara's gaze stayed on the screen. "Rocks change," she said absently. "Sometimes that's the interesting part." He snorted. "If you say so. I've got 6 trucks waiting on clearance to move fuel to that uplink, and the only thing changing in my world is how much their drivers hate me." She gave him a fractional smile and dragged a small red circle around the empty gullies on the terrain model. "They ever shoot at your convoys from here?" she asked, tapping the spot. "Not that I've heard." "Why?" "Because they've been shooting at something," she replied. "On the far range. Test shots. All last week." She alt-tabbed to another window and brought up a plot of impact reports. Small red dots clustered on the far side of the basin, all oriented along arcs that intersected the bowl. Artillery, mortars, small arms, they've all been working their angles. And they all seem interested in us. He shrugged, unconvinced. "Maybe they're just getting zeros." "Maybe." She didn't sound convinced. A new line appeared on the spectrum analyzer tool in the corner of her screen. A thin, almost imperceptible brush of interference along the outer bands of their communication spectrum. Mara frowned and leaned in. It didn't sit like the usual background noise. It had shape. A rise and fall that felt deliberate. She flagged it with a click and opened a log entry, fingers moving quickly. "Possible interference pattern," she typed. "Monitor over next 24 hours. "Atmospherics again?" the logistics officer asked, following her gaze. "Could be," she said. "Could also be someone testing something they don't want us to notice." He lifted his hands in surrender. "You're the intel. I just moved boxes." A sergeant ambled past behind them, balancing a clipboard and a sandwich. He paused, eyeing the rifle icon in the corner of Mara's laptop background, a relic from training days. "You know," he said with a grin, "I still remember the way you cleaned house on the long-range range. Best shot in the battalion," they said. "Now you're chained to spreadsheets. Who did you upset?" Mara's jaw twitched just once. "Spreadsheets don't talk back," she replied, not looking away from the screen. "Yeah, well," the sergeant chuckled, "if we're lucky, they'll let you play with the big toys again someday." She changed the subject with a practiced ease that spoke of repetition. "You got the latest patrol reports from Tower 2? He took the hint, flipping his clipboard up. "Yeah, same old. Locals moving along the ridges, some trading, some watching. Nothing aggressive." "Oh, and they say the goats look thin this year, if that helps your analysis." "It all helps," she said. The general's visit that morning came with very little warning. 1 minute, Mara was preparing a more detailed brief on the possibility of someone shaping the basin. The next, the word came down that a battlefield circulation was happening, and all presentations were being trimmed to key points only. She watched from the back as the general stepped into the tent, flanked by his aide and a public affairs officer with a camera slung over one shoulder. Hands were shaken, jokes exchanged. The air shifted toward something more performative. Her slide about the missing shepherd tracks and the suspiciously clean gullies? Cut for time. Her notes about faint interference on the net and the possibility of an emerging electronic warfare capability in the area? Summarized in a single sentence, and then dropped in favor of more optimistic talking points about base improvements and increased cooperation with local leaders. When her turn came, she delivered the sanitized version. The general listened, nodded, and moved on. From the edge of the group, she watched him walk the perimeter later, helmet on, sunglasses reflecting the basin. He stopped to talk with tower guards, with mechanics elbow-deep in an armored vehicle's guts, with medics at the aid station. The cameras caught the smiles, the brief shoulder claps. Mara lingered a few paces behind the main crowd, notebook in hand, eyes not on the general but drifting again and again toward the ridge. Up there, along a distant slope, she saw movement. Tiny figures against the sky, silhouettes of villagers pushing carts, leading animals. Nothing unusual in itself. The locals had used those paths for generations. But today something was off. They were leaving. Carts piled higher than usual. Bundles strapped tight. Goats pushed faster than they liked to move in the heat. The line of villagers was flowing away from the basin, not toward it. Every few minutes, one of them would glance back over a shoulder toward the bowl and the foreign base planted inside it. Mara felt the hairs on the back of her neck lift. She lifted her binoculars, focusing on a cluster of huts that usually sent smoke into the sky this time of day. No smoke. Doors shuttered. Animals gone. The hillside looked abandoned. "Hello. Everything good, Captain?" The general's aide had drifted back toward her, one eyebrow raised. "Locals are moving out," Mara replied, lowering the binoculars but not her guard. "Earlier than usual. And not just a few. Whole families. It's market day in the town," the aide said dismissively. "They'll be fine. We've got engagement reports saying everyone's happy with our presence." On the other side of the base, the armory door stood open, its interior cool and dim. A weapons rack lined one wall, rifles and carbines neatly ordered, each in its assigned spot. On a separate shelf, in a hard case with its own label, lay the M24. The unit's designated sniper was out with a recon element on the far side of the ridge, stalking trails that might one day carry enemy fighters. That left the rifle unused, the case collecting dust and fingerprints, but nothing else. Mara passed it on her way in to check a patrol report, eyes drawn to the stenciled letters on the lid. She didn't touch it, didn't slow down, but her mind couldn't help itself. From the armory doorway, she could see a sliver of sky and the upper edge of the ridge. From this angle, the geometry clicked. If someone lay in the right fold of rock up there, just off the obvious lines of sight, they'd have a clear, plunging angle on the entire basin and on the tent that housed the base's brain. She paused just long enough to glance from the case to the ridge and back again, mentally drawing lines that no one else in the room seemed to notice. "Something wrong, ma'am?" a nearby corporal asked, following her gaze. "Just thinking," she said, forcing herself to move on. Long day. By late afternoon, the base had settled into that deceptive lull between the heat of the day and the chill of evening. Shadows lengthened. The hum of generators grew louder as the ambient noise of human activity dipped. The signal tech ran a routine radio check, his voice echoing in the command net. "Net control, this is Basin 6 on comms check. How copy?" "Over." One by one, call signs responded. 6, this is 1-3, loud and clear. 6-2-1, reading you 5 by 5. The chorus of acknowledgments was reassuring, familiar. When the check ended, the tech leaned back, satisfied, and then frowned. "Hey, you hear that?" he asked over his shoulder. "Hear what?" Mara replied, eyes on her map. "That hum." He tapped the headset against his ear. "Net's green, but there's this background interference. Comes and goes." He toggled a filter, watching the spectrum. The faint brush she'd seen earlier had grown a little thicker, a little more defined. "Record it," she said. "Keep an eye on it. If it spikes, I want to know." The day's last light slanted across her map, turning the grease pencil marks into bright lines. She picked up the pencil and circled the gullies again, pressing harder this time, until the red was almost angry. She added 2 more circles farther along the ridge, places where an observer could hide, where a mortar spotter might sit with binoculars and a radio, unseen against rock. She imagined lines of fire arcing from those circles into the basin. Imagined shells falling along those arcs. Imagined what it would look like if someone shaped all of that into one coordinated blow. Her unease grew, a steady pressure behind her sternum. When she tried, once more, to push a request for a drone ret ask over those gullies up the chain, she ran into the same wall. "Batteries are limited, Captain," the operations officer said. "We've got birds watching a convoy, one on that suspected weapons cache, and one on hires tasking. Unless you've got something more concrete, then the goats are gone and the rocks feel wrong." She didn't. Not in a way that would survive an email. So the request was logged, marked as non-priority, and pushed to the bottom of a pile no one would get to until later. After dinner, after shift change, after the first rounds had already been fired. Outside, the villagers had finished leaving. The hills around the basin grew still, the only movement the occasional wheeling bird and the distant flicker of sunlight on glass somewhere near the ridgeline. In the command tent, the general reviewed his schedule. The staff rotated through their tasks, and Mara stared at the map. Red circles forming a pattern her instincts screamed at, even as her orders kept her seated behind a laptop. She underlined them once more. Then, almost as an afterthought, she drew a thin line from the tent's icon to a particular fold in the ridge. The line curved gently, like a stream. An hour later, that same line would be traced in high explosive. Evening slid into the basin on quiet feet. Floodlights blinked on along the perimeter, throwing bright cones into the gathering dark. The ridgeline became a black sawtooth against the deepening blue of the sky. Shadows thickened in the gullies. The satellite uplink on the plateau beyond the ridge glowed faintly, a distant cluster of artificial stars. Inside the fence, the base shifted into its night routine. Patrols rotated. Tower guards tightened chin straps and pulled jackets closer against the incoming chill. The command tent hummed, its screens brighter now that the outside world had dimmed. Mara sat at her usual station, the soft shell now replaced by a plate carrier whose weight she barely felt anymore. The red circles on her map seemed to glow in the lamplight, like warning beacons no one else could see. The signal tech's voice cut through the room. All stations, Basin 6, stand by for comms check. Over. He went down the list, each call sign answering in turn. It was a familiar litany, one that brought a little comfort even on nights when the air felt full of unasked questions. 6, this is Tower 2, loud and clear. 6, Patrol 3-1, Roger, 5x5. 6, Uplink Security, good copy. When the last response came in, the tech gave a small, satisfied nod. Net's green, sir. The general, standing near the map table, grunted approval. Good. Keep it that way. For a few seconds, everything seemed normal. Then the tech's expression changed. His eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. He tapped his console again, cycling display modes. Bars on the screen began to dance higher, thicker, like someone turning the volume knob on invisible static. What is it? Mara asked, feeling that now familiar tightening in her chest. Interference spike, he muttered. Way above usual. It's like someone just lit up a transmitter right on top of us. Before anyone could respond, the speakers over the map table squealed. A high, warbling tone cut through the tent, loud enough to make everyone flinch. The tech grabbed for the volume knob, twisting it down, but the damage was done. Every radio in the tent, all the carefully tuned devices that connected them to every tower, every patrol, every vehicle, screamed with the same shrill protest. Then, all at once, the noise snapped off. Mara felt the silence land like a weight. The tech frantically toggled channels. 6, this is net control, radio check, over. 6, this is net control, how copy? Over. His voice grew tighter with each unanswered call. Any station, this is net control. Do you read? Over. Nothing. No crackle. No hiss. No half-heard reply. On the digital map, icons that had been slowly pulsing to indicate movement froze in place. The thin lines showing their last known positions hummed faintly, then dimmed. It's not us, the tech said, almost to himself. All my internal diagnostics are green. We didn't lose power. We didn't lose. Someone is jamming us. Hard. Location, the general demanded. The tech could only shake his head. Negative fix, sir. It's wideband and strong. Directional, maybe, but I need time to... He didn't get that time. The first mortar round hit the outskirts of the base with a sound like the sky tearing. The floor of the tent jumped. Coffee sloshed. Someone lost their footing and crashed into a folding chair. Dust sifted down from the ceiling, the tent seams creaking. Impact! Impact! A runner yelled, bursting through the flap. North side. His words were drowned out by the next explosion, closer this time. The percussion thumped in chests, rattled teeth. A faint, high-pitched ringing bled into the edges of hearing. Mara grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, eyes snapping to the map. Already, someone was slapping markers down where the impacts had landed. Rough estimates, but enough to see the pattern forming. The shells weren't scattered. They were clustered. Tight. Another impact. Another. Walking inward. They're bracketing the supply stacks, the ops major said, voice tight. They're herding us toward the... He didn't finish. They both saw it at the same time. The arcs of impact were curling toward the center of the bowl, not sweeping the base. Focusing. Toward us, Mara said softly. They're walking fire toward the command node. On the ridge above them, a heavy machine gun opened up. Its distinct rhythm, deep, measured, authoritative, rolled over the base in bursts. The tracers slashed downward, their paths clear even through the dust. They chewed into the main east-west avenue inside the base, pinning anyone caught in that stretch of open ground between barriers. From Tower 2 came the faint, muffled crack of rifle fire in reply. But without comms, the tower could only guess where to aim. Their reports, their corrections, their desperate calls for more eyes and more guns were now trapped inside silent radios. A forward observer, positioned on a small rise to give them eyes on the ridge, was one of the first to pay the price. A shell landed close, throwing him sideways. His spotting scope rolled out of his hand and tumbled into the dirt, lens cracked. "FO's down," someone shouted from outside, the words reaching the tent like an echo. Inside, the general snapped orders that had nowhere to go. "Give me Tower 2 on the line. I want suppressive fire on that machine gun now. We need to locate the mortar pit." "Sir, the net. We can't just sit here and take it," he barked, anger rising not from fear, but from the helplessness of shouting in an empty air. He turned to runners instead. "You get to Tower 2, direct them to search for muzzle flashes along this sector." He jabbed a finger at the map, drawing a rough arc. "You get to the QRF platoon, tell them to prepare to counterattack up the north slope if they get the word." The runners nodded, eyes wide, and bolted out into the night. They didn't all come back. Mara's gaze locked on the map, brain trying to impose order on the chaos. Each new impact was another data point, another clue. The spacing was tight. The corrections were quick. Whoever was walking the rounds and knew exactly what they were doing. She grabbed a grease pencil and started connecting dots. "These shells aren't being fired blind," she said, voice cutting through the calls for medics and the curses. "They've pre-plotted this. Someone is spotting for them in real time." She drew a line along the angles of descent, tracing it up toward the ridge. It intersected almost perfectly with one of her red circles from earlier, a fold in the rock she tried to get a drone to overfly. "This is where I'd put a spotter and a jammer truck," she said, tapping the intersection. "In dead ground from our towers, with clean lines into the basin." No one had the bandwidth to argue with her now. Outside, the heavy machine gun continued its methodical work, keeping the main movement route under a curtain of fire. Troops trying to shift from one sector to another were forced to crawl, to wait, to risk sprints that ended in bodies stumbling and falling. The base was fighting blind against an enemy perched comfortably above them, connected, coordinated, and ruthless. Inside the tent, one of the staff officers dragged a hard case in from the entryway, bumping it over cables and boxes. "Found this in the armory," he gasped. "If we can get someone up in a tower with it, maybe we can—" Mara didn't need to see the stenciling to know what was in the case. Her throat tightened on instinct alone. The staff captain popped the latches with shaking hands. The lid opened on the M24's padded interior. The rifle nestled inside, like a sleeping animal. "Who here's qualified?" he demanded, looking around. "Our sniper's out with the recon team. Anybody else shot one of these for real?" Silence answered him. A few hands half rose, then lowered again. Qualified, perhaps, in the sense that they'd passed a range once. Not qualified in the way this situation demanded. In a way that meant trusting yourself to take the kinds of shots that changed lives for better or worse. Mara's eyes locked with the rifle. For an instant, the tent around her dissolved. She was back on a different range under a different sky. The wind was colder there, sharp enough to cut through gloves. Targets lined a distant berm. The instructor's voice had been calm over the radio. "Shooter ready. Ready. Target 400, left of center. On your shot." She'd exhaled, settled, pressed. The rifle had bucked. The round had flown, but something had been off. A misread gust, a hurried trigger press, a tiny error at the firing line that had blossomed into a disaster downrange. The memory of a body being loaded onto a stretcher. The dull thump of rotor blades. The sick, spiraling knowledge that her shot had done that. That if she hadn't been behind the rifle, that person might have gone home intact. "Captain," the ops major's voice hauled her back to the present, to the choking dust and the screaming radios and the distant, relentless thump of the machine gun on the ridge. She blinked, the image of the stretcher fading, but not gone. Outside, Another shell landed close enough to make the tent poles whine. The far wall billowed inward before snapping back. In the corner, an infrared camera monitor glitched, flickered, then returned with hazier imagery than before. IR feeds are degrading, someone called. Could be the same interference hitting the net. Could be deliberate. Hart watched the impacts on the map shift subtly. The shells now walking toward not just the command tent, but also the hardened container that housed the uplink's encryption gear. They're aiming for our brains, she said, mostly to herself. The command node and the comms. They don't just want to scare us. They want to take something. On the ridge, under cover of the mortar fire and machine gun, an enemy assault team began probing the wire. Shapes moved low and careful along the shadows of the hillside, feeling for weaknesses in the perimeter. Without reliable IR and without functioning radios, the defenders' ability to spot and coordinate against them shrank by the second. Mara ran the math in her head. If the jammer stayed up, they couldn't call their own artillery. They couldn't reach higher for air support. They couldn't even coordinate between sectors. The enemy could keep them pinned, bleed them, then send a focused group to slash into the center and take what they wanted: hard drives, officers, hostages. Her gaze dropped to the M24 again. No one else had stepped forward. No one claimed it. The case lay open, the rifle waiting, as rounds fell closer and closer around them. Her heart pounded. The old memory pressed at the edges of her vision, refusing to dissipate. The face of the injured trainee she'd visited in the hospital afterward. The whispered conversations about whether she should ever be behind a rifle again. Her lungs felt tight. "If you're so sure they're sitting in that fold," the general said, catching her line of sight and following it to the map, "how do we kill them without comms?" "We can't from here," she replied. "Not with this tent as our only vantage. The angle's wrong." He slammed a fist down on the table. "We have towers, we have machine guns. None of them see where they're really sitting." She cut in, the words sharper than she'd planned. She took a breath, forcing her tone back under control. "The fold I'm talking about is masked from our standard positions. You need to be almost outside the wire, higher up on the slope to see into it." Another impact. Closer. Dust churned. The staff captain holding the M24's case looked from the rifle to the general and back again. "Sir, we can't leave that nest up there. Not at this rate. If someone could get high enough to spot for us." "We don't have a sniper," the general snapped. "I'm not handing that weapon to just anybody." Mara felt the moment hang there, stretched taut. She could stay behind the table, behind the laptop, behind the relative safety of the intel role that said her job ended at analysis. Let someone else run, someone else shoot, someone else carry the weight of an imperfect shot. Except there was no one else. If they waited for the recon team to get back, the base might already be burning. If they waited for the net to clear, they might never make the call for help. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. She thought of the villagers leaving, of the missing tracks on the terrain model, of the interference she'd logged and no one had prioritized, of the red circles she'd drawn over and over, trying to make someone see what she saw. If she did nothing now, all of that would have been for nothing. She'd have seen it coming and watched it happen anyway. "Sir," she said, voice low but steady, "I can take the rifle." The word surprised even her. Heads turned. The staff captain's eyes widened. The signal tech glanced back over his shoulder, as if he'd misheard. The general stared at her. "You?" he demanded. "I've shot out to 1,000, she replied, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "Qualified on this platform and others. I know the terrain. I know where they're likely sitting. I can." "You are an intelligence officer," he snapped. "You're not tasked as a sniper on this mission. And you used to be the best shot in the battalion." The sergeant from that morning muttered under his breath, the words carrying farther than he intended. Silence folded in around them for a heartbeat. Another round landed close enough to blow a hole in the tent wall, hot air and dust blasting across the map. The lights flickered. Someone swore. Outside, a scream cut off sharply. Mara didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. "If that jammer and their spotter stay up," she said, more quietly now, "we can't call for help, and we can't coordinate. They're going to keep walking those rounds in until they hit this tent or the uplink. You know that." He did. The calculation played across his face. The risk of letting an unauthorized shooter act versus the certainty of sitting still under a mathematically tightening artillery net. He opened his mouth, whether to forbid her or to relent. Even he might not have known. Before he could decide, the roof shuddered. A support pole groaned. Plaster dusted from the makeshift ceiling, coating their hair and shoulders. Time compressed. Mara didn't wait for the verdict. She stepped away from the table, each movement drawn from some deep, older training she'd tried to bury. In 3 strides, she reached the open case, her hand surprisingly steady as she lifted the M24 free. The rifle's weight settled into her palms like an old conversation resumed. A staff major moved to block her, hand half raised. "Captain, you can't just let her go," another officer said quietly. It was the same one who'd cut her briefing short that morning, but there was something different in his voice now. Something like understanding. "We are out of good options. She's the only one who saw this coming." The major hesitated, then stepped aside. Mara slung the bandolier over her shoulder, checked the chamber, and turned toward the tent flap. Each step felt like a point of no return, but there was no room left for hesitation. Behind her, she could feel the general's stare burning between her shoulder blades. She didn't look back. If she did, she might stop. And if she stopped, the line she'd drawn on the map, between them and the fold in the ridge where death was sitting patiently, would end at this tent. As another shell landed just outside, rattling the steel table against their boots, she pushed through the canvas into the screaming twilight. Outside, the world had become a storm. Dust and smoke rolled through the base in waves, lit from within by the flashes of impacts. The air stank of burnt propellant, hot metal, and disturbed earth. Every boom from the mortars thudded through the chest, a constant reminder that the ground itself was no longer safe. Mara stepped into it with the M24 slung across her back and a small pouch of ammunition thumping lightly against her hip. To her left, a squad sprinted from one barrier to another, shoulders hunched, rifles clutched tight. One man stumbled as a fragment caught him in the leg, his teammates dragging him the last few meters into cover. A medic skidded in beside them, hands already moving. To her right, a truck idled uselessly with its hood up, the engine compartment peppered with shrapnel holes. A mechanic crouched behind its wheel well, helmet pressed against mud flap as he rode out the latest salvo. Shouts cut through the noise in snatches. "Stay down until the next." "Lost contact with." "They're walking it in, we have to move." Instead of heading toward the nearest watchtower, the obvious place any would-be marksman might go, Mara turned away from it. She dropped into a shallow drainage ditch that ran along the inside of the base's inner wall. Most people thought of it as a nuisance, a place where rainwater collected and boots got muddy on bad days. To Mara, who'd studied the base's blueprints when they'd first arrived and mentally overlaid them with the terrain, it was a hidden artery. Down here, the world narrowed to a strip of dirt and concrete. The wall loomed on one side, scarred by shrapnel. On the other, the backs of supply containers and vehicle bays flashed past like scenery in a tunnel. Incoming rounds still hit, the sound muffled but no less real. The ditch couldn't protect her from a direct hit, but it shielded her from line-of-sight rounds and from the eyes on the ridge for the moment. She timed her movements between impacts the way she might once have timed breaths between shots. Boom, shudder, dust rain, go. She sprinted along the ditch, boots scraping, pack bouncing. When the impacts grew closer, she dropped, pressing herself flat against the damp earth as fragments hissed overhead. Sandbags on the wall above her spitting dust. At one bend in the ditch, a young private lay propped against the wall, fingers fumbling with a tourniquet that refused to tighten properly around his upper thigh. His face was pale, eyes wide with a fear that had not yet tipped into panic. "Ma'am," he gasped when he saw her. I can't." She skidded to a halt beside him, heart pounding. For a fraction of a second, the rifle on her back and the wounded soldier in front of her pulled her in 2 directions at once. The line to the ridge. The line to the immediate bleeding problem. Training, the old kind that predated sniper school and ranged across basic first aid, kicked in. "Here," she said, dropping to one knee. Her hands moved quickly, guiding his. You're doing it right, just not far enough up. Higher, closer to the groin. Yes, there. Now twist. More. You're not going to break it. You want it to hurt. He winced, teeth gritted, but the bleeding slowed. Color began to creep back into his face. You keep that tight, she said, giving the windlass an extra turn. You let anyone who gets near you know you're stable, but you need evac when we can move casualties. Got it. Yes, ma'am, he said, breathless but steadier. Thank you. Guilt flickered across her thoughts as she pushed herself back to her feet. Every second spent here was a second the jammer stayed up, the mortars walked closer, the machine gun pinned more people. But leaving him without that extra twist would have haunted her too. She ran on. At the far corner of the base, the drainage ditch gave way to a section of collapsed barrier where a previous incident, a vehicle accident, a construction mishap, no one had ever really fixed it, had left a gap in the inner wall. Emergency patches of sandbags and concertina had been thrown up, enough to satisfy inspection, but not enough to make it truly secure. Mara slipped through that gap, ducking under the sagging wire and stepping out onto the narrow ledge of rock beyond the wall. Here, outside the fence but still within the shadow of the base, the noise changed. It was still loud. The mortars still fell. The heavy machine gun still beat its terrible rhythm from the ridge. But the immediacy of shouted orders and clanking metal faded, replaced by the thin whine of wind cutting along the slopes. The ledge she'd chosen wasn't a proper path. It was a shelf formed by centuries of erosion, just wide enough for a human if the human didn't mind hugging the rock and ignoring the drop below. The terrain worked against her with each step. Loose stones skittered under her boots, sending small avalanches of gravel rattling downslope. Every cascade sounded deafening to her ears, though the battle's roar likely drowned it out for anyone else. Above, the heavy machine gun shifted its arc of fire slightly. Tracers lashed closer to the section of wall she'd just slipped through, chewing into sandbags and throwing up sprays of dirt. The gunner had seen movement, maybe this was just the next bracket in a pattern none of them could fully see from down below. She pressed herself against the rock, waiting for the gun to traverse away again before edging forward. Hand by hand, boot by boot, she climbed. Sometimes she moved on her feet, leaning into the slope, body angled, so the rifle didn't bang against the rock. Sometimes, when the ledge narrowed to little more than a lip, she dropped to hands and knees, crawling, the stones scraping her gloves. The rifle was always a consideration. She cradled it close, protecting its barrel from being knocked out of true, shielding the optic from direct hits. The M24 was built to survive field abuse, but precision glass didn't care about reputation. Smoke from burning fuel inside the base curled upward, carried by eddies of wind that made the air taste faintly of plastic and oil. Dust from each mortar impact drifted through the basin like ghosts, sometimes obscuring her view of the ridge, sometimes clearing abruptly to reveal terrifying clarity. Visibility waxed and waned with each gust. Her world alternated between too much and too little. Without a clear picture, she fell back on memory. She conjured the terrain model from that morning in her mind, the three-dimensional rendering of the ridge's folds and creases. She overlaid it on what she could see now. This rock outcrop, that stunted tree, the slope angle beneath her boots. She counted steps, 10 to the first bend, 15 to the boulder that looked like a crouching animal, 20 more to the notch in the rock that, from above, would open into a view deep into the fold where she'd circled danger in red. A near miss interrupted her internal math. A mortar round hit the slope above and to her left, close enough that she felt the shock wave as a physical slap. Stones splintered, flakes pelting her back and helmet. One larger chunk glanced off the edge of her optic housing with a sickening crack. She flattened herself over the rifle, instinctively trying to shield it with her body. When the ringing in her ears eased enough for thought, she lifted her head and brought the scope up to eye level, heart pounding. A thin chip had broken off the edge of the optic's front lens, a crescent of missing glass. The rest held, but her field of view through the scope was now marred by a blurred edge where the damage intruded. She tested it quickly, peering through. The center remained clear, The reticle was sharp. The missing chunk cut into one quadrant of the view, a blind corner she'd have to work around. Of course, she muttered under her breath. Nothing's free. She could still shoot. She just had less room for error. Higher up, the ruins of an old observation tower clung to the slope. It had been built by someone else in some other conflict, rough stone and crumbling concrete. When the base went in, engineers had deemed it too unstable to use and built newer structures elsewhere. To Mara, it was perfect, not for living in, not for standing up in, but for what she needed, a pile of broken walls and collapsed floors that offered angles no standardized tower ever would. She approached it low, keeping the bulk of the ruin between her and the ridge. The remnants of an old ladder clung to one wall, metal rungs rusted and bent. Climbing that ladder would have put her in full silhouette against the sky. Any half-competent observer with binoculars could have picked her off. Instead, she crawled around the side where the tower had partially slumped down the hill. The collapse had created a jagged opening, a sort of lopsided window formed by broken masonry and rebar. Through it, she could see the basin below, the base now a patchwork of smoke plumes and flickers of muzzle flashes. The command tent was still standing, though a corner looked torn. Vehicles smoldered. Tiny figures ran between cover. Above the basin, the ridge stretched, dark and jagged. She lay prone behind a broken wall, extending the rifle slowly over the edge until the barrel just cleared the stone. The bipod legs clicked into place on the rough surface. She wiggled her elbows into a stable platform, building a firing position out of whatever the ruin offered. The optic came back to her eye. The reticle settled into its small, imperfect world. She panned the scope along the ridge, past the obvious gun positions, where machine gun flashes spat from behind sandbagged emplacements, past the more scattered muzzle bursts of riflemen firing down into the basin, past a cluster of figures hunched behind rocks, waiting for orders. She was looking for something else, something quieter and more dangerous. There, at first, it was just a shape that didn't match the surrounding rock. A darker line where shadows fell wrong. But as she fine-tuned her focus, compensating for the chipped edge of the glass by shifting her eye slightly, the picture sharpened. A camouflaged technical truck nestled into a fold of the ridge, its paint scheme cleverly matched to the rock around it. A mast rose from its bed, bristling with antennas and panels, pointed straight at the basin like a spear. Beside it, on a flat patch of stone, knelt a figure with binoculars glued to his eyes. Another man crouched nearby with a handheld radio, antenna angled toward the mortar pit out of sight beyond the fold. Every few seconds, the spotter spoke into a throat mic, gesturing with his free hand. Moments later, shells landed in the basin with uncanny accuracy. Behind them, partially shielded by a low wall of rock, several crates were stacked neatly. Ammunition, perhaps, or something worse. Mara felt a curious stillness settle over her. The abstract pattern she'd seen on screens and paper all day, the missing shack, the interference, the red circles, had resolved into this one concrete image, the beating heart of the trap. Her fingers found the elevation turret. She calculated distance by eye, comparing the size of the men and the truck to known dimensions, factoring in the slope's angle and the thin mountain air that thinned bullet drop. Beside the truck, a small flag fluttered on a short pole, its cloth snapping in the wind. The way it moved gave her a sense of wind, speed, and direction up there, different from what she felt on her own face. She made adjustments. In the basin below, the general glimpsed her silhouette atop the ruined tower, just a figure with a rifle, alone against the sprawling backdrop of ridge and sky. His outrage from moments earlier boiled over into a shout that carried, faintly, even above the battle's noise. Who gave her that rifle? He didn't know her name yet. Not really. Not beyond a line on a roster, an intel brief he'd skimmed. He didn't know the hours she'd spent staring at maps, the guilt she carried from another range, the calculation she'd just made about what staying inside would cost. He only saw a violation of protocol in the middle of his command going to pieces. Up on the slope, Mara didn't hear him clearly. The words came to her as fragments, lost in the wind and the distant thunder of guns. She had her own noise to deal with, the pounding of her pulse, the whisper of her breath in her ears, the memory of another shot gone wrong. She anchored the rifles, but firmly, to her shoulder. The stock felt familiar now, heavy but reassuring. Her cheeks settled into the groove worn by countless other shooters before her. Her breathing slowed, not by magic, but by discipline. In through the nose, out through the mouth. In, out. Each cycle smoothed an edge inside her that had been jagged moments earlier. Through the chipped optic, the world narrowed further. The reticle rested on the spotter's neck, then moved to his eye line, then shifted slightly to accommodate for the way he was braced against the rock. The background interference she'd seen on her screen earlier, the ghostly smear in the spectrum, was now incarnate in metal and flesh. Her finger took up the first pressure on the trigger, the way she'd been taught, smooth, even no sudden jerks. The weight built under her fingertip, a growing tension waiting for release. Down in the tent, staff scrambled, maps slid, dust swirled. The general's shout hung in the air, half demand, half fear. Up on the tower, everything inside her scope went quiet. The thunder of mortars, the chatter of rifles, the heartbeat of the machine gun, they all faded into a low, distant rumble, like a storm a few hills away. The only sounds left were intimate ones, the faint grind of gears as she adjusted the focus, the rasp of fabric against stone as she shifted slightly, the muted thud of her own pulse echoing in her head. She took in a breath. Let half of it go. Held. The rifle's bolt had already slid forward, chambering the first round with a solid, metallic click that tied this moment back to what we'd seen in the opening before time rewound. We're here again. Reticle on target. Gravity and wind calculated. Options exhausted. As the last of her hesitation burned away in the face of what she saw in the scope, a carefully hidden hub that was methodically tearing her world apart, she committed. Finger tightening, she began to press the trigger through that final, inevitable fraction of a millimeter. Down below, the general's furious question still hung in the air. Who gave her that rifle? The narrator's voice threaded through the tension, quiet but certain. The better question, it suggested, was what would be left in that basin if she hadn't picked it up. The trigger broke. The rifle bucked gently into her shoulder, the sound of the shot cracking across the basin. And this time, we stay with her.